town turned to a crime wave after that, didn't it?
Well, that's true. It was during the days of the Chisholm Trail, Lockhart was a pretty wide open town, you might say. We know from the old Western movies, you've all seen these movies of what it was like in Dodge City and Abilene, and you had your saloons and the saloon girls and the gambling and shootings in the street. Let me tell you, people, Lockhart wasn't much different than that at one time. There were a lot of saloons, there were a lot of shootings, and there was gambling, and there was alcohol, and there were the saloon girls. And we were right on the Chisholm Trail. You see the picture up here is of where Harrison's real estate agent is today. That was known as the Iron Front Saloon when it was built. We're talking a little bit later than the 1870s. This was done in the 1880s. And I'm going to tell you about a shooting that took place almost in front of this building. Actually, it took place in front of the building next to it, which was at that time known as the Emerald Saloon. They were right together. There was one saloon and this one next to it. And later, the Emerald Saloon was purchased by Mr. Halfin, and then N.O. Reynolds, who was a retired Texas Ranger, got the property and opened the saloon in that building. So there were two saloons right next to each other. Well, Louis Halfin owned this building, and he had the Iron Front Saloon in it. His sister, Pauline Blum, didn't have an E on them. It was B-O-U-M. Pauline was she was the lady that ran the saloon, and that was pretty a raunchy job to have to do, and it's turned over to a woman. So you can imagine what kind of a person she might have been. Well, there was a frequent customer at the Iron Front Saloon quite often. His name was Morgan White. This happened in 1890, by the way. Morgan White was a regular customer, and he was a pretty mild-mannered farmer from over in the eastern part of our county, except when he was high on alcohol and morphine. And that happened quite often. Well, one day he came in on August 3rd, 1890. Morgan was under the influence, and he came into town, and he started hollering obscenities and using language that was derogatory to the character of Pauline Blum. Well, Ernest Blum, the woman's husband, happened to meet White out in the middle of the street, out on the Courthouse Square, and cowhided him. Now, how many of you know what cowhiding is? I saw 3 or 4 hands go up. I had to look it up myself the first time I saw it. When you cowhided somebody, you whipped them with a leather bullwhip. And that's what happened to Mr. White for saying the things about Mrs. Blum. Of course, White took this as an insult, and you can imagine being out in public and being publicly whipped on the streets of Lockhart out there on the Courthouse Square. He sent his son back to his house out east of town, told him to get his shotgun and bring it back. And he did. Later that day, Mr. White, Marvin White, starts looking for Mr. Blum. And he heads to the Iron Front Saloon, where he thought he probably would be. And he's hollering more derogatory things about Mrs. White, not Miss Blum, and I'm sure he's still under the influence at that point. And by that time, the local city marshal, J.J. Sanders, comes over and arrests Morgan White, takes his gun away from him, and starts to take him to jail. And they go next door they're on their way past this to the next building. And we can see the next one. This is the back of the saloon, and you can still see this if you go across the street at this alley, right across the street. It says N.O. Reynolds Saloon. It's still visible, thank goodness. It hadn't faded out completely. Well, at the time, that was the Emerald Saloon, and Mr. Reynolds bought or became proprietor of this a few years later. But this was what is now known as the Farm Bureau. In the back, in the front, is the Farm Bureau. Well, as they were walking in front of the Farm Bureau, they were heading to the jail. Mr. Blum hears all of the commotion. He hears Mr. White still bad-mouthing Ms. Blum, even though he's in custody, to the sheriff. Mr. Blum comes down out of the Iron Front Saloon and steps out and with a Winchester rifle, point blank, shot Morgan White in the head and took the whole top of his head off on the front square out here in front of the Farm Bureau building. Obviously, Mr. White no longer said anything. White was dead. Now J.J. Sanders arrests Ernest Blum and takes him to jail. The Blum was never, he was arrested, but he was never convicted of anything. You know, after all, in those days, if you were to insult a man's wife, especially in public, you weren't going to get away with it. And no one was going to convict Ernest Blum for anything. So that's one of the many shootings that took place in Lockhart. The earliest one that I was able to find was a man that was killed in a saloon on the east side of the square in 1855. And there were a number of others that were shot and killed in various saloons around the Courthouse Square.
All right, let's go to Joe Bunch.
Let's talk about one of the most mysterious mysteries that occurred in Lockhart, and it sort of chimes well with the new TV series, How to Get Away with Murder in Caldwell County. And I'm speaking of Sheriff Franks.
Oh, honey.
You don't have to name any names.
Keep it a mystery.
Well, it was a mystery. It was never solved. But it happened on a Saturday night when Sheriff Franks was walking home from the courthouse. He used to stay. He had, I think, this routine pretty much every night, if not every Saturday night. I'm not sure, but Gary Franks, who's a young friend of mine, his dad is Curtis Franks, a lifelong friend. And he's writing a book about this, which will be interesting. I hope I'll live long enough to read it, and or have someone read it to me. And, but it happened, the railroad right away came right down where 183 is now, and there was a loading dock for the railroad company, which was on the south side of the street. What street is the jail on? I can't think. Whatever street that is.
Market.
Market, or as he was crossing Market Street, stepping over the railroad line there, someone was hiding under that loading dock and shot and killed him right on the spot. And it was raining that night, and it was purposely, he wanted the ground wet. And I was later told that the man who committed the crime, he didn't tell me, but I was told through a friend that knew him real well, who was Holland Page, and that this man went to Luling and bought over boots that he could just stick his foot in. So all evidence was that they saw this huge foot. Well, they couldn't find anyone that had a foot that size, and that mystery was never solved. That murder was never solved.
Can I comment on that?
Yes,
The sheriff was coming back from the theater, which was across the street where it is now. And he'd gone up to the square, and he was going down Market Street, the south side of the square, and crossing the railroad tracks there on Highway 180, where 183 runs. And that's where the shooting occurred. He was going to the jail because the county jail is where the county sheriff and his family lived. The first floor was always the residence of the county sheriff. Well, about 2 months before this happened, before the sheriff was mysteriously shot, one of the city deputies came into the courthouse one day with a gun, and he had the gun in a holster, but he had his hand on it, threatening the sheriff. And there were words spoken between them, and Sheriff Franks told him to leave, and he started to go down the hallway of the courthouse. This was up on the second floor. And the sheriff got up, walked back into his office, came back out with a shotgun, and armed himself. He obviously didn't have a gun on at the time that he was confronted at first. He went in, came out with a gun, and when he came out into the hallway of the courthouse, the deputy John L. Smith was turned around, and when he turned around, the shooting started. Sheriff Franks did not get hit. The deputy was killed in this shootout. It was never really determined what caused the fight, other than the fact that the newspaper account says that he had called him a liar. But there were reasons why he was up in the courthouse threatening the sheriff to begin with. Another newspaper account says that they had been opponents against each other when they were running for county sheriff a while back, and there had been hard feelings between them all of that time. Yet there were other personal reasons for the killing, I've been told. And anyway, it appears that the people in Lockhart felt that the sheriff was in the wrong for whatever reason. And several months later, the sheriff gets assassinated, and I've been told that most everybody in Lockhart knew exactly who it was that killed the sheriff, and they wouldn't say. They said, who knows? They never did solve this. They brought in law enforcement officers from other counties. They brought in Texas Rangers. They interviewed many people in Lockhart. They found suspects, people that could possibly have been the person that had done it, several of them. Never did find any evidence to convict anybody. And so that murder has never been solved.
When was this?
This was in 1915.
That's the picture of the courthouse that was up there
Well,
about the same time.
this is the courthouse in 1907. When this occurred, it wasn't but 7 or 8 years later. So it probably looked pretty much that way in 1915.
Donaly, with all this crime going on, what did we do to incarcerate these criminals?
Well, it's in this modern day, it's really kind of strange how our concept of jails and things. When the first jail that Caldwell County had was here, it stood on the property where the museum is today. Where the jail museum is on East Market Street. And it was a log cabin. It was built in 1855, and it lasted for 3 years before it burned down. Wood buildings didn't last very long in those days. Sometimes they were burned intentionally, sometimes they were burned because of wood burning stoves and poor knowledge of what you were doing. Kerosene lanterns, all kinds of things could cause a house or a building to burn in those days. But in 1858, the jail burned. This building was the courthouse that was here before the one we have now. Believe it or not, that was our courthouse.
Was it in the same place?
It was, we've had 3 courthouses. I don't know what the first one looked like because we don't have a picture of it. But this is the second courthouse. And the one we've got now is the 3rd courthouse. They have all been on the courthouse square. That's where the square was made for.
So Donaly, after the one burned, did this one come into play, the courthouse as a jail?
No. Actually, there was a courthouse that fits in between this one and the one we've got now. No, between the log cabin and this one. The jail, since they didn't have a jail, the log cabin burned, and so they incarcerated people in the basement of this courthouse. This wasn't the jail, but in theory it served as a jail. The basement did. And a lot of people didn't know that there was a basement. But there isn't a basement for the courthouse we have now. It obviously must have been filled in. But there was one in this building. And the basement was used to incarcerate prisoners for a while. The second jail, which was in this building in the basement, served until 1873. From 1858 to 1873, it was being used. In the 1870s, there was a lot of violence and lawlessness in Texas. There was a great need for a sturdy rock or stone building for a jail. And this basement in this building was very overcrowded. And I think one of the funniest stories I've ever heard about this is that one of the reasons that prompted them to decide on building a new jail was not only was it overcrowded, but it was infested with fleas. So the poor prisoners who were incarcerated in the basement of this courthouse had to endure very bad, cramped quarters as well as an infestation of fleas as well. Interesting. Now, the next jail is this building right here. This was built in 1873. It's on the corner of North Main and Walnut. And let's see, this is the front of the jail. And you can see the cells are right on the ground floor. You could walk up there and hand a hacksaw to somebody. And they could saw their way out. I mean, this is ridiculous. But there is where the jail stood. This is where Blacks has, there's a little dance studio in there now. It's right across from from a couple of the antique shops. And Archway Antiques is just next door to it. So I think most of you know where that building is. And behind it is the Episcopal Church going down that street. This jail was used, there was a room upstairs where the jailer lived, and there was a room downstairs that they used for cooking for the prisoners. But that jail lasted until 1908, and the building was owned, the land was owned by Mr. Mazur, one of the Mazur brothers, and he sold it, and the jail was moved to where the museum is today. In 1908, they passed a $25,000 bond. The city of Lockhart did to build that jail that's over there now, that the museum's in. And it was finished in 1909, and that's when they moved all the prisoners to the new jail. So that was in the new jail, which is the museum. The first floor, again, was used for the county sheriff and his family. The upstairs, two floors up the second, third floor were cells. There were 15 cells on the second and third floor. And then at the top, there's one room, there's one cell at the very top that is, I call it an isolation room because there's only room for one person up there. But I've always maintained, when I go up there and look at things out there, I maintain if I ever had been incarcerated in this jail, I'd want to be in that room at the top because the others are dark, dingy, no light, overcrowded with bunks for you to sleep in. It's difficult to imagine the heat in the summer and the cold in the winter. But up in this room up at the top, it's well lit. You've got a panoramic view of the town of Lockhart. You don't have to deal with another prisoner in the cell with you, and you have it nice and quiet. That they just give you a book or a magazine to be in.
And then you also had a great story to share with us about the most infamous football game between Lockhart and Columbus, and it involves Sheriff Walter Ellison.
Oh, yeah. Now, that was, I think, a by-district playoff. And as I said, that we had that old SAP train, and it went to Columbus and had a special excursion that cold winter night to bring the people from Columbus, and I think everyone from Columbus in that town came, because they had 3 or 4 cars on that. People just got off, and they were, because I lived over on Trinity Street, and I had to cross those railroad tracks to go to the high school, and I walked that when I was a kid, and I just saw so many people. I thought, my stars, where are they all coming from? And I think everybody that came had a bottle on their body somewhere, in the lady's purse, or in the man's hip pocket, or in their coat pocket, because it was a cold night. And this was a dry county. We didn't allow all that in the first place. And Walter Ellison was sheriff. And if you knew Walter Ellison, he did one thing. He told you to do something, you better do it. And if you didn't, he'd whip out his 6-shooter and pistol whip you across the head. And people would be on the sidelines, and the ground was wet. And I was there, and I got out on my knees to see the ball game, but you weren't allowed to stand up to knock the view off of people in the stands. And what else was going by? Well, there was 2 men from Columbus, a tall guy and a short guy, and they had a big old blanket up over them, and they were hollering for Columbus, and they would hear Mr. Ellison come by, and he said, sit down, sit down. And I heard one of those men says, who is that little SOB thinks he is? And Mr. Ellison heard it. He wheeled back around. He said, I said, sit down, or something. And the tall guy, Mr. Ellison, kicked him on his shin. I could just see him there. Boy, saw every bit of hit on his shin. And this man reached over to grab his shin, and Mr. Ellison took his 6-shooter and just knocked him in the head. He fell over. And the other man, I can't remember how he treated him, but he treated. And then there'd be a crowd of people come around there, and Tom Brown was his deputy sheriff, and Mr. Ellison says, haul these 2 in. And when the game was over, our jail was full of people from Columbus. About half of them had to spend the night in the jail. And the train went home empty with a few people. So after that, I went with Mary's story, and I made a trip to Houston one time together. Mary was selling real estate, and I went with her, help her drive. She's afraid to drive to Houston. And we ate breakfast in Columbus, and I said, Mary says, for goodness sakes, please don't say anything about Lockhart. Says, well, they'll put us in jail. And we didn't. We don't think we opened our mouth about anything when we ate our breakfast. We got out of Columbus and left. And people would tell about going to Columbus, and that famous restaurant there, I can't think of the name of it now. And that's where people would eat. And you went there, and sometimes they found out you were from Lockhart, they wouldn't serve you. Because they never did forgive Lockhart's sheriff for knocking them in the head with that 6-shooter and putting them in jail for standing up and drinking there on the football field.
I knew several people who were in that football game. They were football players, and they said that the fighting erupted in the stands, and then it spread to the football field, and between the players and then the referees and the coaches. And before you knew it, he said that everybody was flowing out of the stands like the end of a football game, and they were out on the field fighting, and they were dragging people off the jail, and they were dragging people down to the railroad track to put them on the train. And as the train started pulling out, they said some of these people were still slugging Lockhart pipes through the windows because they were trying to hit them through the windows as they were pulling out. So this must have been quite a scene. And Sheriff Ellison was rough. He really was. It was long before you could violate people's civil rights. Let me tell you, Mr. Ellison was the longest serving sheriff in Caldwell County history. And he was appointed the sheriff when Sheriff Franks was killed in 1915. He served, he was elected in 1916, and then every 2 or 4 years after that, until he retired in January of 1941. Wow. So he was in there, according to my calculations, it was 25 years, 7 months, and 16 days. But it was the longest serving sheriff in the county.
Some people call him Limping Jesus.
Limping Jesus. You've got to be tough to do that.
Donaly, do you have a card there that says it's time for a break?
I think so. I could use it.